Welcome back to Nomad Nomad, Echoes of Adventure, where we take deep dives into some of the most important motorcycle journeys from this century and the last. I'm still your hapless host, Jeff Thomas, and after treating you to the introduction a month ago, in episode 1 we raced through a brief history of motorcycle adventure, and then in episode 2 we literally raced through the life of Erwin Baker, a man who, were it not for his nickname Cannonball, would have still been a mystery to most of us. After Erwin Baker crossed the USA in record time, a journalist in New York had given him the nickname Cannonball. It had been a reference to the Cannonball Express, a late 19th century high-speed train service, and something already made famous by the nickname of its own record-breaking driver, John Luther Jones, aka Casey Jones, a steaming and a rolling on the Cannonball Express. Before that episode, I'd known a little bit about Erwin Baker, but embarrassingly, I didn't know that Casey Jones had been a real person, like a genuine historical figure. Admittedly, he wasn't a man I'd spent too much time thinking about, but in this episode, The Adventures of Asil, subtitled Vladivostok, Vodka and the Iron Tigers, I honestly don't know if the central character is a real person or not. The central character is Asil, a young man from Istanbul who, after reading Ted Simon's Jupiter's Travels, sets out to explore the world on his own motorbike. I'll recall Asil's story as it was told to me, and then retold by me to others for the millionth time in what is probably an endless cycle. Now, I'm telling you this from the perspective of another traveller, which in this case is rather self-indulgently me. And when I'd first heard the story of Asil, alcohol had certainly been consumed. I'd probably been drinking beer for an hour or so, but when I'd retold the story to the Iron Tigers in Vladivostok, I'd been totally shit-faced on vodka. How and why I'd been in Vladivostok is a long story, and one that I'll only touch on today. But for any traveller who's ever ridden across eastern Russia, why I'd decided to stay with the Iron Tigers is probably self-evident. As I take you back to the summer of 2008, I'll tell you that 4 years earlier in 2004, Russia's government had announced that construction on the long-promised Amur Highway had begun, and when in early 2008 Vladimir Putin had announced to the people that the road was complete and open for business, I couldn't have been happier. However, when in July of that same year, as I'd ridden east out of Chita watching the city vanish in my mirrors, it seemed that beyond the first few kilometres of pristine asphalt, the workers had only just begun breaking ground. Good morning, Dyslexia. When was the Amur Highway constructed?
Hapless Jeff, construction of the Amur Highway was scheduled to begin in the year 2004. However, despite announcing the completion of the highway in 2008, in reality, construction of the highway had only just begun.
As always, Dyslexia, thank you for that wonderful insight. And would I be right in assuming that 2004 and 2008 might have been important election years in Russia?
Well, sometimes you do surprise me, and this is certainly one of them. The years 2004 and 2008 were indeed both important election years in Russia. And, as President Putin had promised that the Amur Highway would be his gift to the Russian people, those things may indeed be connected.
Well, thank you, Dyslexia. But moving on from politics, the Amur Highway is just one part of the longer Trans-Siberian Highway and stretches the 2,100 kilometers from Chita in the west of Siberia to Khabarovsk in the east. It runs with the Chinese border to its south and generally the Trans-Siberian Railway to its north. It crosses the Zilov Gap, the area made famous by Austin Vince and his team, first in Mondo Enduro when the lack of a passable road defeated them, and then later in Terra Circa when they'd returned to a still unpaved Siberia and through sheer grit and determination conquered it. Anyway, it was before crossing the still unpaved Zilov Gap back in 2008, thankfully riding a trusty Triumph Tiger and during a heatwave, that I'd first heard the story of the young Turkish motorcycle adventurer Asil. Sitting beside a campfire on Lake Baikal's island of Olkhon, the story was told by a German guy called Rick Hellerhoff. At the time, Rick hadn't consumed quite as much beer as me, but a few weeks later, and I'd retold the story at the Iron Tigers workshops in Vladivostok, we'd all been totally off our tits on vodka. That all happened 13 years ago, and alcohol had certainly altered my memories. But having written the story down at the time, whatever truth or fiction it held then, I can now pass on to you lovely people. Or person, because yes, I have seen the YouTube viewing figures. But hey, the Amno Highway wasn't built in a day, so let me tell you the short story of Asil. Asil was a young Turkish man with two passions in life, motorcycles and travelling. However, with 1 year of compulsory national service in the Turkish armed forces looming, he'd become disillusioned with his life in Istanbul. So, in order to avoid the inevitable, he'd packed his belongings onto his motorcycle and left that world behind him. He travelled across Europe, through North and South America, down into the centre of Africa, and finally arrived in Mongolia. With empty pages in his passport diminishing, in Ulaanbaatar, Asil had visited the Turkish embassy in order to have his passport replaced. Unfortunately, staff at the embassy realised that Asil had avoided his 1 year of military service back in Turkey and had refused to help him with his passport. Having left home in order to avoid spending 1 year in the military, Asil had no intention of returning, and being a stranger in a strange land, had turned to his new Mongolian friends for advice. After much discussion, it appeared that there'd been just one possible solution to his unusual predicament. Asil should find and marry a Mongolian girl, and then apply for Mongolian citizenship, and then replace his old Turkish passport with a nice new Mongolian one. The unusual circumstances had called for an equally unusual solution, but after finding a girl that he genuinely cared for, their plan had actually worked. After marrying the girl, Asil had applied for and received Mongolian citizenship, and shortly thereafter had collected all of the documents he'd needed to apply for a new Mongolian passport. With a spring in his step, Asil had taken himself and the documents to the Ulaanbaatar passport office and waited patiently in line. Eventually, his application had been taken and inspected by an official. But the news that greeted him wasn't what he'd expected. Unfortunately, as a Mongolian citizen, Asil would be required to complete not 1 but 2 years of compulsory national service with the Mongolian army. Well, Alanis Morissette, you missed that bugger. But although for the sake of history I'd wanted the story to be true, ironically, for the sake of Asil and his new Mongolian wife, not so much. To say that as a German Rick Hellerhoff lacked any sense of humour would be a stereotypical slight on a nation, but in Rick's case, that didn't make it untrue. For a living, Rick composed complex coding for computers, and for a hobby, even more complex pieces for jazz. And earlier that day on Olcon, as he'd watched me wrestling my tiger from a well-hidden pit of sand, rather than helping the hapless Englishman, he just casually waffled on about how the second law of thermodynamics had made my failure inevitable. Later that day, I'd got my revenge when he'd parked his own BMW in an equally well-disguised bog. But although Rick Hellerhoff was a man with little time for bullshit, without reason or evidence, he'd seemed to think that the story of Asil had been true. He'd heard it from another traveller, and a day after my own retelling of the story in Vladivostok, the Iron Tigers suggested that I search for Asil's name in their visitors' book. The story of marriage and national service they hadn't heard before, but a young Turkish chap by the name of Asil had sounded familiar to some of them. But although we couldn't find any message in their visitors' book, they'd been sure that a few years earlier, riding a dark green Honda Africa twin, Asil, or Asif as they'd seemed to remember him, had passed fleetingly through their lives. Well, colour me curious, but after 13 years of not giving the adventure of Asil's a second thought, I'd actually like to find out if the story might be true. Dyslexia. How do we go about finding out if the story of Asil could be true?
Hapless Jeff, by we, I assume that you really mean me. But, thankfully, as I am a non-sentient form, when you behave like an arrogant wanker, I do not take it personally.
Well, somebody got out of the wrong side of the mainframe this morning. But without knowing Asil's family name, or even if it was Asil or Asif, tracking him down in conventional ways would be nigh on impossible. Turkey has a population of around 85 million people, 43 million of them male, and at least 15 million of them would fit into the profile of Asil. On the other hand, I seriously doubt that millions of Turkish males of his age have travelled the world on motorbikes, and even fewer would have gone on to become Mongolian citizens, so maybe this haystack isn't quite as big as I'd thought. To satisfy my own curiosity, A while ago, I'd posted a question about Asil on one of the adventure travel forums. Sadly, like the response to my videos here, there'd been radio silence, absolute crickets. But with Dyslexia's help, maybe we can at least verify or dismiss some of the more factual elements of the story. Dyslexia, does Turkey have compulsory military conscription?
Hapless Jeff, for male citizens between 20 and 41 years of age, Turkey does indeed have a national policy of compulsory military conscription.
Well, that's interesting, but Dyslexia, just to cross the I's and dot the T's, did you find any reason why military conscription might not apply to someone like our friend Asil?
Hapless Jeff, there are certain exemptions, for example, for students in higher education, but such exemptions involve deferring, rather than avoiding, the compulsory element of the service. Turkish citizens residing overseas can in certain circumstances also avoid conscription by paying a monetary fine to their government. However, this exemption requires the citizen to have worked in full-time employment abroad for at least 3 years, so Asil would not seem to qualify.
Well, thanks to Dyslexia, we now have evidence of a motive for Asil to get his adventurous ass out of Turkey. Assuming that when applying for his passport in Ulaanbaatar, he had, as the story states, been 23, then in the time frame between leaving Turkey and arriving in Mongolia, he certainly would have been in that vulnerable age bracket for conscription. Now, that doesn't mean that Asil did it, or even that he existed, but it also doesn't mean that he didn't, if that double negative makes any sense. But what about Mongolia? Dyslexia, does Mongolia have a policy of national conscription?
Yes, Mongolia's government, more correctly known as the Great State Khural, also have a policy of compulsory military service for all male citizens, which, to my great surprise, means that twice today, your instincts have been correct.
Well, Dyslexia, I do like to impress you at least once a day, but with compulsory military service confirmed at both ends of Asil's story, deliberately escaping it in Turkey, and then being accidentally captured by it in Mongolia, the evidence for truth appears to be building.
Hapless Jeff, I hate interrupting you, especially when your timbers are shivering with success, but I now have additional information. As the Mongolian conscription policy stands today, rather than the 2 years mentioned in the story of Asil, the length of military service required is in reality only 1 year.
Well, my little piranha fish, you haven't quite unshivered my timbers yet. According to Siri, if for religious or ethical reasons Mongolian males refuse to undertake 1 year of conscription in active military roles, they're automatically conscripted into a non-active role, but for a full 2 years. Of course, we still don't know if Asil existed, let alone the reasons he might have had for wishing to avoid conscription. But if those reasons had been religious or ethical, then the Mongolian policy allowing 1 year or 2 would still make logical sense. Well, in my mind at least, but as I want the story to be true, maybe I'm just employing my own bias here. Dyslexia, can foreigners gain Mongolian citizenship? Dyslexia? Dyslexia, can foreigners gain Mongolian citizenship?
Hapless Jeff, I'm sorry, but while Siri was assisting you with our investigation, I was briefly distracted by pictures of a man with a real scent of adventure.
Very funny, Dyslexia. A man with a real scent of adventure. I see what you did there.
Well, that is a very interesting turn of phrase, because, as I'm the one with access to your computer logs, it is me who can see everything done by you.
When you finish your own important research, can you look into my question about Mongolian citizenship, please?
Hapless Jeff, I am very capable of multitasking and already have the answer. So, while foreigners seeking Mongolian citizenship is uncommon, it is certainly possible, especially I suspect, for a man as lush and desirable as, say, Ewan McGregor.
Well, she's obviously a little distracted because although Mongolia do seem to welcome foreigners becoming citizens, though perhaps not if they happen to be American foreigners, what Dyslexia failed to add was that there is an element in the rules that might finally sink all hopes I have for the good ship Asil. You see, before applying for Mongolian citizenship, beyond proving your understanding of the language, history and culture, as a foreign national, you must have already resided in Mongolia for a full 5 years. and during those 5 years spent no more than 120 days outside of the country. Sadly, one thing that the Asil story doesn't mention is timescales. And although the 5-year rule doesn't mean that Asil couldn't have applied for and received Mongolian citizenship, it certainly makes it more unlikely. I found no physical evidence to show that Asil exists, or that his life unfolded as the story tells. And although an absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, I'm currently cruising towards the conclusion that Asil is something of a Santiago figure. I say that because it was whilst following the journey of Santiago, the main character in The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, that after a decade of forgottenness, my thoughts had drifted back to Asil. Just as I'd been rooting for the young and adventurous Santiago, I'd wanted Asil to find his treasure too, and then maybe go on to invent the unlosable 10mm socket and spanner set. It just felt like the right ending to a great story, and I felt the same way about Santiago in Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. Maybe all along, the story had been nothing more than a joke, a story whose only intention had been to deliver a witty punchline. But the guy who told it to me, Rick Hellerhoff, didn't do comedy. Not because he was a German, obviously, but because he was Rick Hellerhoff. There again, Asil's story could have been allegorical and devised by Rick whilst watching me tease the tiger from its sand dune. Another way of telling me that everything eventually turns to shit without needing to invoke the second law of thermodynamics. It's a shame because after carrying Asil's story with me for so long, I'd wanted it to be true. Well, maybe not the part where he'd spend 2 years protecting Mongolians' extensive borders against the even more extensive armies of Russia and China. But you know what I mean. Maybe deep down I'm just a sentimental old fart, and perhaps when I tell the story again, instead of Asil, I might actually call him Santiago. Anyway, thanks for coming with me on this tangent of a journey, and please leave a comment if there's a particular journey or character that you'd like to see covered in the future. Or not, it's all good. Anyway, I've been your hapless host, Jeff Thomas, and as always, encouraging you to always ride safe, leaving more smiles and miles behind you.
And I've been Dyslexia McGregor, and will remind you to never mention that apple tart Siri in my presence again. Good night.
So until next time, bye-bye now.